The candle had almost burned to nothing when the Duchess of Ashworth pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall and stopped breathing. Behind the door, her husband's voice was low, but not low enough. "She will never know," the Duke said. "By spring, it will be arranged. You will have the townhouse. You will have my name on the lease, if not on your finger." A woman laughed softly. Not cruelly, almost fondly. As if this were the most natural conversation in the world. The Duchess did not move. She did not gasp. She stood in the dim corridor of her own home in a silk dressing gown the colour of dried roses, and listened to her husband promise another woman a future that had, until that moment, belonged to her. Somewhere down the hall a clock struck 11. She did not cry. She did not shake. She turned, quietly, and walked back to her chambers, and by the time she reached her door, her face had already become a mask that would not slip for the next 6 months. This is where her revenge began, not with screaming, not with confrontation with silence, the kind that plans, but to understand how a woman built an empire of quiet ruin from a single overheard sentence. We must go back. Back to the beginning, when Eleanor Whitmore was still a name spoken with warmth in country ballrooms, before she became the Duchess of Ashworth, before she learned that love, in her world, was often a transaction disguised as a promise. Eleanor had been the third daughter of a modest but respected family, the kind that had land but little liquidity, a good name but a leaking roof. She had not been raised to expect a duke. She had been raised to expect a comfortable match, a quiet life, perhaps a small manor with roses in the front garden. Then came the autumn assembly at Rosewood Hall, and with it Edmund Ashworth. He was tall in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He danced like a man who had never once considered that a woman might refuse him. When he asked Eleanor for the second dance, a scandal in itself, 2 dances with the same woman, she had laughed because she assumed he was teasing. He was not teasing. "You dance like you're thinking of something else entirely," he told her, spinning her beneath the chandeliers. "I was thinking of the soup," she said. "It was too salty." He had laughed, then a real laugh, surprised out of him, and something in his face had softened in a way she would only recognize years later as the last honest expression she ever saw from him. They married within the year. Her family celebrated as though a war had been won. In some ways it had. The Ashworth name brought security her family had not felt in a generation. Eleanor moved into Ashworth Manor with hope stitched into every trunk she packed. For the first 2 years she believed she was happy. Edmund was attentive in the way that important men often are, briefly but generously when he remembered to be. He brought her books from London. He held her hand at dinner when his mother criticized her posture. He called her Eleanor in front of his friends, and she had liked the sound of that possessive, back when it still felt like tenderness and not property. It was in the 3rd year that the visits to London grew longer. At first she told herself it was business. Dukes had business estates, required management, politics required presence, and London had both in abundance. She busied herself with the manor, with correspondence, with the slow, patient work of learning how to run a household the size of a small village. She noticed the perfume before she noticed anything else. It was not hers. It was floral, sharper than the rosewater she wore, with an undertone of something like orange blossom. She found it on his coat sleeve one evening in autumn, and she told herself it was nothing, a crowded assembly, someone brushing past him. She wanted very badly to believe that. The mistress had a name, Clara Renfield, though Eleanor did not learn it for another year. Clara was a widow of modest means and considerable beauty, the kind of woman society tolerated, but never fully welcomed, existing in the space between propriety and scandal, where certain men found her irresistibly convenient. Eleanor first saw her at a distance, at the opera, 3 rows down, laughing at something in her fan. She noted only that the woman was lovely, and that Edmund's eyes had lingered a half-second too long in that direction before he turned back to Eleanor and asked if she was enjoying the second act. Very much, he had said, and meant it as a lie, meant to protect them both. The years that followed moved the way rivers move, slow, patient, carving their path invisibly beneath the surface. Edmund's absences grew longer. His letters grew shorter. He came home smelling of orange blossom more often than he came home smelling of nothing at all. Eleanor did not confront him. This was not weakness, it was strategy, though she did not yet know it as such. She had learned, in her years at Ashworth, that accusations without proof only handed a guilty man the moral high ground of righteous denial. She had seen it happen to other wives, women who wept and pleaded, and were then quietly, patiently, made to look hysterical, unstable, unworthy of trust. She would not give Edmund that satisfaction. Instead, she watched. She listened. She learned the particular rhythm of her husband's lies, the way he cleared his throat before an untruth, the way his eyes moved to the window when he was calculating rather than remembering. She began, without fully admitting it to herself, to keep records, not out of vengeance, not yet, simply out of a need to know the shape of the thing she was living inside. She noted dates. She noted the names of hotels mentioned carelessly in passing. She noted the sums withdrawn from the estate accounts that she, as Duchess, was nominally permitted to review, but rarely encouraged to scrutinize. She began to understand, slowly, that her husband's affair was not merely a betrayal of the heart. It was, increasingly, a betrayal of the ledger. Money was moving, quietly, steadily, into accounts she did not recognize toward purposes no one explained to her. It was on a rain-heavy evening in her 5th year of marriage that she overheard the conversation that would end everything and begin everything else. She had gone downstairs for a book, left in the drawing-room, moving through the manor's corridors, the way she always did at night, softly out of habit rather than intention. The door to Edmund's study was not quite closed. Lamplight spilled through the gap in a warm, guilty line across the floorboards. She should have walked past. She has told herself in the years since that she meant to walk past. But his voice stopped her. "She will never know," he said. "By spring it will be arranged. You will have the townhouse. You will have my name on the lease, if not on your finger." Clara Renfield's laugh drifted through the gap in the door, warm and unbothered, the laugh of a woman who believed she had already won something. "And your wife," Clara said. "She suspects nothing." "Eleanor suspects the weather," Edmund said. "She's a good woman, loyal, dull. She will spend her whole life waiting for me to come home, and she will never once imagine I might not." The words landed like small, precise stones. Not dramatic, not shouted, simply true, in a way that made the whole marriage rearrange itself in Eleanor's mind, retroactively, into a performance she had mistaken for a life. She did not open the door. She stood very still in the dark hallway, in her rose-colored dressing gown, and let the sentence finish echoing in her chest, until it stopped hurting quite so sharply, and started, instead, to sharpen into something else. Something with edges. She turned and walked back to her chambers, and did not sleep that night, though she gave every appearance of having slept beautifully when her maid woke her the next morning. "You look well rested, my lady," the maid said, arranging the curtains. "I am," Eleanor said, and smiled, and meant it, because for the first time in 5 years she understood exactly what she was dealing with and understanding. She had already begun to feel less afraid. The weeks that followed her discovery were, to any outside observer, entirely unremarkable. Eleanor attended church. She hosted her usual Thursday teas. She wrote to her sister about the price of good wool and the difficulty of finding a competent gardener. She smiled at Edmund across the dinner table and asked him with genuine-sounding interest about his business in London. "Tedious," he told her, cutting his meat. "Contracts. Nothing that would interest you." "No," she agreed. "I suppose not." Inside, something had gone very quiet and very cold, the way a lake goes still before the first frost. She had decided somewhere in that sleepless night that she would not scream. She would not weep in front of him and give him the chance to comfort her out of guilt the way men do when they wish to feel forgiven without the inconvenience of changing. She would not write to her family and turn herself into an object of pity passed between drawing rooms. She would learn everything, and then she would act, once, completely, and never need to act again. Or, her first ally, though she did not yet think of him that way, was Mr. Jasper Colm, the estate's solicitor, a narrow, precise man who had managed the Ashworth accounts since before Eleanor's marriage. She invited him to tea under the pretense of reviewing household expenditures, a task she had every legal right to undertake as Duchess, though she had rarely exercised it. "I should like to understand the full accounts," she told him, pouring his tea with a steady hand. "Not merely the household ledger, all of it." Mr. Colm's eyebrows rose a fraction. "All of it, my lady?" "All of it," she said. "I find I have grown curious about numbers, Mr. Colm. It is a new interest of mine." He studied her for a moment longer than was strictly polite, and something in his expression, not quite a smile, but its cautious cousin, suggested he understood more than he said. "I shall have the ledgers sent to your study within the week," he said. "Thank you," she said. "And, Mr. Colm, I should prefer this remained between us for now. The Duke has enough to occupy him without troubling himself over household trivialities. Of course, my lady, it took her 3 weeks of quiet, patient reading, late at night by candlelight, to understand the shape of what Edmund had built. He had, over the past 2 years, been slowly transferring funds from the estate's tenant income into a series of private accounts, ostensibly for London investments that Mr. Colm, when gently pressed, could not fully account for. She began to understand that Clara's townhouse, the one promised by spring, was being paid for with money that belonged, by law and by marriage, to the Ashworth estate, to her, to their unborn children, should any ever come, to the tenants whose rents funded a lavish life across in a city she rarely visited. This was no longer merely a broken heart. This was theft, dressed in silk and orange blossom. And theft, unlike heartbreak, could be proven. She began carefully to build her case, not with confrontation, but with documentation. She requested copies of correspondence between Edmund and his London bankers, framed as her wish to understand the estate's finances in case of emergency, a reasonable request for any wife, and one Edmund, distracted and confident in his own cleverness, did not think to question. "You've become quite the little accountant," he said one evening, finding her at the study desk surrounded by ledgers. "I thought it wise," she said, not looking up. "A duchess should understand what she is duchess of." He had laughed fondly, condescendingly, the laugh of a man who could not imagine the quiet woman before him as anything but decorative. "Very sensible," he said, and kissed the top of her head, and left for London the next morning, and Eleanor sat very still after the door closed behind him, feeling the ghost of his lips on her hair like something that no longer belonged to her. It was around this time that she made her second, more delicate move. She began writing letters, carefully worded, warmly toned, to several of the Duke's business associates, women married to men in similar circles, wives she had previously kept only at arm's length out of the same instinct that had, until now. She invited them for tea. She listened more than she spoke. She let conversations drift gently toward the subject of London society, of who was seen where, of which townhouses had recently changed occupants. It was Lady Pembroke, sharp-eyed and permanently amused by other people's secrets, who first mentioned Clara Renfield by name. "Oh, the widow on Chandos Street," Lady Pembroke said, stirring her tea with visible relish. "Quite the talk of certain circles. No one knows who pays for that townhouse, though everyone has their guesses." Eleanor kept her expression perfectly, pleasantly blank. "How curious," she said. "Isn't it just?" Lady Pembroke said, and moved on to a story about a scandal involving a card game, entirely unaware that she had just confirmed, in a single careless sentence, everything Eleanor needed to know. By the following spring, the very spring Edmund had promised Clara her townhouse, Eleanor had assembled a private collection of evidence that would have made any solicitor in London uncomfortable. Bank transfers, correspondence, testimony from servants she had quietly, discreetly befriended over the preceding months. Small kindnesses that had earned her loyalty no one else had thought to cultivate. She had learned, too, something about herself in the process. The fear that had once made her small in her husband's presence had transformed, slowly, into something closer to patience. She no longer flinched at his voice in the hallway. She no longer scanned his face for signs of affection. She now understood had rarely been real. She had become, without entirely meaning to, a woman who watched rather than hoped. It was Mrs. Hartley, the head housekeeper, who gave her the final piece. "He's asked for the emerald set to be sent to London, my lady," Mrs. Hartley said one morning, her voice carefully neutral. "The one that belonged to the old Duchess. Said it needed cleaning by a jeweller there. Eleanor's mother-in-law's emeralds, the ones meant by tradition to pass to the next generation of Ashworth women, meant, some day, for a daughter Eleanor did not yet have." "Did he say which jeweller?" Eleanor asked, her voice perfectly even. "Chandos Street, my lady, I believe." "Chandos Street? Clara's Street?" Eleanor set down her teacup with great care, as though the china itself might shatter if she did not treat it gently, and felt the last soft, foolish part of her heart, the part that had still, despite everything, hoped this might somehow not be as bad as she feared, go quiet. He was giving away the family emeralds to her. That evening, alone in her chambers, Eleanor did something she had not done since the night behind the study door. She allowed herself finally to cry, not from weakness, but the way a storm finally breaks after days of pressure necessary and cleansing. She cried for the girl who had danced twice with a handsome duke and believed it meant something pure. She cried for the years spent waiting for a man who had never once considered her worth being faithful to. She cried until there was nothing left, and when she rose from her bed the next morning, something in her had settled, finally, into resolve. She was done waiting to be hurt. It was time to act. Her plan, when it finally took shape, was elegant, precisely because it required no scandal, no shouting, no public unraveling that might stain her own name alongside his. She understood, with the clarity of a woman who had spent months studying her enemy's habits, that Edmund's greatest vulnerability was not his heart. It was his pride, and beneath his pride, his money. She began with the accounts. working quietly with Mr. Rand. Com, who it turned out harboured his own long-simmering disapproval of the Duke's mismanagement of tenant funds and welcomed the chance to correct it under proper authority. Eleanor began the slow legal process of reclaiming control over the estate's finances. As Duchess, she held rights she had simply never exercised: the power to review, to question, to redirect funds designated for household and tenant use. The transfers to the London accounts, she told Mr. Orr, calm, laying out the ledgers between them, are to cease immediately. The Duke may object, my lady. The Duke, Eleanor said, has been using tenant rents to fund a mistress's townhouse. I imagine he will object rather less than you'd expect. Once he understands how thoroughly this has been documented, Mr. Combe looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind his careful composure. I shall draft the necessary letters, he said. The next step required a different kind of courage, the courage to speak to Edmund's mother, the Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman who had never entirely warmed to Eleanor, but who valued the Ashworth name above almost everything else, including, Eleanor suspected, her own son's comfort. Eleanor visited her in the small parlour the Dowager preferred, with its view of the rose garden and its collection of family portraits watching from the walls like silent judges. I have come to discuss the emeralds, Eleanor said. Once tea had been poured and the requisite pleasantries exchanged, the Dowager's spine straightened almost imperceptibly. The emeralds. They were sent to London, to Chandos Street. For cleaning, I was told. Something shifted behind the older woman's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Chandos Street, the Dowager repeated slowly. I believe you know the significance of that address better than I did. Until recently, Eleanor said, keeping her voice gentle, without accusation. I did not come here to distress you. I came because those emeralds belong to this family, not to a woman on Chandos Street, and I intend to see them returned. The Dowager was quiet for a long moment, her hands very still in her lap. My son, she said finally, has always had an appetite larger than his sense. Yes, Eleanor said, I have come to understand that. What do you intend to do? Eleanor met the older woman's eyes, and for the first time since her marriage, she saw something like true respect pass between them. I intend to take back what is mine, Eleanor said quietly. Completely, without a single scandal that could touch this family's name. I would rather you helped me than opposed me, but I will proceed either way. The Dowager Duchess studied her for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, almost smiled. You have more spine than I gave you credit for, she said. Very well. What do you require of me? It was, perhaps, the first true alliance of Eleanor's married life, and it would prove decisive. With the Dowager's support, quiet but absolute, in a way only a mother's disapproval of her own son can be. The Dowager wrote to the family jeweller in London, requesting the emeralds be returned immediately to the Ashworth vault, citing an urgent need for their appraisal ahead of an upcoming family occasion. The jeweller, unaware of any scandal, complied without question. Edmund, still confident and careless in London, remained entirely unaware that the ground beneath him had begun, very quietly, to shift. He returned to Ashworth Manor in early summer, full of the easy charm he always carried like a well-worn coat, and found his wife waiting for him in the drawing-room with a calm, pleasant expression that gave away nothing of the months of quiet work behind it. "Eleanor, my dear," he said, kissing her cheek. "You look well. I feel well," she said, and meant it in a way he could not have understood. "I've missed London terribly," he said, settling into his chair. "Business, you understand?" "Of course," she said. "Tell me, how is the townhouse coming along?" "On Chandos Street, I believe." The pause that followed was brief, almost imperceptible, but Eleanor had spent months learning to read her husband's silences, and she saw it land. The small flicker of surprise quickly smoothed over the recalculation behind his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. "No," Eleanor said, pouring tea with steady hands. "I don't suppose you would be." She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him outright. She simply let the sentence hang in the air between them, and watched, with quiet satisfaction, as her husband's easy confidence flickered for the first time in 5 years of marriage. He recovered quickly. Men like Edmund always did, trained since birth to believe that charm could smooth over any inconvenient truth. "You've been listening to gossip," he said, laughing lightly. "London is full of jealous tongues, my dear. You mustn't credit every rumor that reaches the country." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I mustn't. Which is why I did not rely on rumor at all." She rose from her chair, unhurried, and crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the drawing room, where a folder had been waiting, prepared for exactly this moment. "I have the transfer records from the estate accounts to the London bank," she said, laying them gently on the table between them. "I have correspondence between your solicitor and Mr. Colne regarding the Chandos Street property. I have testimony, should it ever be required, from 3 separate members of staff regarding the emeralds sent for cleaning. And I have," she added almost gently, "a rather detailed account of a conversation I overheard 6 months ago behind the door of your study on a rainy evening in autumn." Edmund's face, for the first time in their marriage, went entirely still. "Eleanor, you said I suspected nothing," she said, her voice calm, almost kind, the way one might speak to a man finally understanding the size of his own mistake. "You said I was loyal, dull, that I would spend my whole life waiting for you to come home, and never imagine you might not." The silence that followed was total. "I heard every word," Eleanor said, "and I have spent the 6 months since deciding precisely what to do about it." Edmund's jaw worked silently for a moment before words finally came, quieter now, stripped of their usual polish. "What do you want?" he said. "It was not quite a question. I want the transfers to cease," Eleanor said, "which they already have, as of last month, on Mr. Combs' authority and mine. I want the townhouse vacated, which it will be, as the lease was drawn against estate funds you had no legal right to allocate without my consent as Duchess. I want the emeralds, which are already home, returned by your mother's own hand, should you care to ask her about it. And I want," she said, pausing, watching him absorb each blow with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had waited a very long time to deliver them, "a divorce." The word landed in the room like a dropped glass. "A divorce," Edmund repeated, "would ruin us both." "The scandal?" "There will be no scandal," Eleanor said, "because you will not contest it. You will agree, quietly, to a legal separation on terms I have already drawn up with Mr. Tambley. Calm. Terms that will be generous to you in matters of reputation, and considerably less generous in matters of money, given that the money in question was never rightfully yours to spend, as you did. You will retain your title. You will retain your dignity, such as it is, and in exchange you will disappear from my life as completely and as quietly as you have already disappeared from any pretense of honoring it. And if I refuse—" Eleanor smiled then, the first genuine smile she had offered him in 6 months, and it was not warm. "Then I will take everything I have gathered, the accounts, the letters, the testimony, the whole sordid architecture of your affair and your theft, and I will bring it before your mother's solicitors, your bankers, and every drawing-room in London that has ever admired the Ashworth name. I will not scream Edmund. I will not weep in public. I will simply tell the truth, carefully, completely, to precisely the people whose opinion you have always valued more than mine. And you will discover that a duke's reputation, once it curdles in society's mouth, does not easily sweeten again. Edmund stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, not the dull, loyal wife he had described so carelessly behind a closed door, but a woman who had spent 6 silent months building a case against him with the same patience he had once mistaken for meekness. "You've become someone else," he said quietly. "No," Eleanor said. "I have simply stopped pretending to be someone smaller than I am." He did not answer that. There was, perhaps, nothing left to say. The weeks that followed unfolded with the quiet efficiency of a plan long prepared. Mr. Colm, working alongside the Dowager Duchess's own solicitors, drew up the terms of separation with a thoroughness that left Edmund little room to maneuver, even had he possessed the will to try. The townhouse on Chandos Street was vacated within the month. Clara Renfield, upon discovering that her benefactor's funds had been abruptly and permanently cut off, departed for reasons that were never publicly discussed, though Lady Pembroke, ever attentive to such matters, mentioned over tea that the widow of Chandos Street had apparently relocated to Bath for her health. Eleanor did not feel triumphant when she heard this. She felt, mostly, tired, in the particular way that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. The Dowager Duchess, for her part, proved an unexpectedly steady ally through the final negotiations, her disapproval of her son's conduct hardening into something almost fierce on Eleanor's behalf. "He was always his father's son," the Dowager admitted one afternoon as they reviewed the final settlement papers together. "Charming careless. I had hoped marriage might correct that. I see now it merely gave him more to be careless with." "I don't blame you," Eleanor said. "I blame him." "As you should," the Dowager said, and there was for the first time something like warmth in her voice when she looked at her daughter-in-law. "You have handled this with more grace than I would have managed, at your age or mine. There is steel in you, Eleanor. I confess I did not see it until now." "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted. "Not fully. Not until I had to." The formal separation, when it was finally announced, was handled with such quiet precision that society barely had time to properly scandalize itself before the story had already been folded into something far less dramatic than the truth. A duke and duchess, it was said, had simply grown apart, as such things sometimes happen among the aristocracy. No fault assigned, no villain named Edmund. Retained his title and a much reduced portion of the estate's discretionary funds. Eleanor retained the manor, the tenant rents restored to their proper use, and, most importantly to her, her freedom, negotiated on her own terms at her own pace without ever once raising her voice. There were whispers, of course. There always were, but whispers, Eleanor had learned, could not touch a woman who had already decided she no longer required anyone's approval to know her own worth. In the months that followed the separation, Ashworth Manor changed in ways both large and small. Eleanor took over full management of the estate, working closely with Mr. Colm and, increasingly, with the tenants themselves, whose rents she now ensured were reinvested directly into the land and the cottages and the small, practical improvements that made lives easier, rather than funding a townhouse in London. She found, to her quiet surprise, that she was good at this, better perhaps than Edmund had ever been, distracted as he had always been, by London and its pleasures. The estate's tenant farmers, who had grown used to absentee management and delayed repairs, began to speak of the Duchess with a warmth that had never quite extended to the Duke. She listens, one farmer told another, over a fence one morning, unaware that Eleanor herself was walking the property line nearby. Asks after the roof before we even have to mention it. Never met a duchess who did that before. Eleanor, overhearing this, felt something settle in her chest that was different from vindication. It felt, instead, like purpose. She wrote to her sister that autumn, describing the changes at Ashworth with a candour she had not allowed herself in years. "I find I am happier now than I have been since before my marriage," she wrote. "Not because I am free of Edmund, though I confess that is part of it, but because I have discovered I am capable of things I never thought to test. I have managed accounts, negotiated settlements, rebuilt cottages, and none of it required a husband's permission or a husband's presence. I do not know what the future holds, but for the first time I find I am not afraid of it." Her sister wrote back with the kind of warmth only family can offer, along with a gentle, teasing suggestion that perhaps, in time, there might be someone new, someone worthy of the woman Eleanor had become. Eleanor considered this for a long moment before writing back. "Perhaps," she wrote, "but I find I am in no hurry. I spent 5 years waiting for a man to love me the way I deserved, and it very nearly cost me everything I had. I think, for now, I should like to simply enjoy being loved by no one but myself and see what grows from that instead." It was nearly a year after the separation that Edmund reappeared at Ashworth unannounced on a grey afternoon in early spring. Eleanor received him in the drawing-room where their final confrontation had taken place, the same tea service laid out between them, though the woman pouring it was, by every measure that mattered, entirely different from the one who had poured it before. "You look well," Edmund said, and there was, for the first time, something almost humble in his voice. "I am well," Eleanor said. "How is London?" "Smaller than I remembered," he admitted. "Clara left within the month, once the funds stopped. I don't imagine that surprises you." "No," Eleanor said. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment, turning his teacup in his hands without drinking from it. "I did not think you had it in you," he said finally. "The patience, the precision, I thought." He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "I thought I knew you." "You knew a version of me I no longer choose to be," Eleanor said without cruelty, simply as fact. "I was quiet, because I believed quiet was what a good wife should be. I have since learned that quiet, properly used, can accomplish a great deal more than shouting ever could." Edmund looked at her for a long moment, something like genuine regret passing across his features. Not enough to undo what had been done, but enough, perhaps, to be real. "I am sorry," he said, "for what it's worth now." "It's worth something," Eleanor said. "Not everything, but something." He left that afternoon, and Eleanor did not watch his carriage depart down the long drive, the way she once might have, hoping for a final glance back. She returned instead to the estate ledgers waiting on her desk, to the letters from tenants needing her attention, to the life she had built, quietly and completely, out of the wreckage of a marriage that had once nearly convinced her she was worth very little at all. Ashworth Manor, in the years that followed, became known, quietly among those who mattered, as one of the best-managed estates in the county, its tenants prosperous, its accounts scrupulously clean, its duchess respected in rooms where she had once merely been tolerated as decorative and dull. Eleanor never remarried, though she was not. In the years that followed, without companionship or without joy, she found in the slow rebuilding of her own life a kind of contentment she had never quite managed to locate within her marriage, a contentment built not on being chosen by someone else, but on having chosen deliberately and completely herself. She kept tucked in a small drawer of her writing desk a single folded letter, not from Edmund, but a copy of her own notes from that first sleepless night, the record she had begun keeping the morning after she overheard the conversation that changed everything. She kept it not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of what she had built from a single terrible sentence overheard through a half-closed door. On quiet evenings, when the manor was settled and the accounts were balanced, and the tenants' cottages stood sound against the winter wind, Eleanor would sometimes sit by the fire and think of the woman she had been the night she stood in that dark hallway, silent, listening. She had been called dull once, by a man who mistook her patience for weakness. She had proven in the end that patience properly aimed was not weakness at all. It was simply revenge, waiting for its moment, and when it finally came, it needed no shouting to be heard.